Hello everyone, thank you very much for signing in and watching my live stream. I'm Mr. Matt and this is Dr. Tot. Dr. Tot, you want a cookie? Very good, and welcome to SAT ACT Prep. So today is the reading section. We're going to go through the main idea reading question on the SAT and ACT, focused primarily on literary passages. So there's a few ways that, of course, they can ask a main idea question in a number of different ways. But there are some common phrases that come up, and then some timing tactics that we're going to talk about and what you can utilize to approach these questions. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And just a reminder, these are live sessions, so there is a little bit of a delay with the iPad, but I will try to mitigate that as much as possible by monitoring the live screen. The document for today's lesson can be found at Certified Learning Center's website. The link to that is in the live session chat form. So if you look at the live chat box, I put instructions in there and a link to the PDF. The Word format, if you're using assistive technology, is also available. And if you don't want to use the link, then you can go to the clccenters.com and go to the blog, and it's at the bottom. Just make sure that you're looking at a document that has this reference number, 1600-4, then you know that you're at the right place. So on the SAT and the ACT, there are 8 different critical reading sections. Well, technically 6 for the ACT and 8 for the SAT. However, they overlap even though they don't have the same number of question formats. They do test very similar subjects or subtopics. So we have the main idea, author's purpose, question type, specific details, inference questions, vocab and context, or just regular vocab questions, organization technique questions, tone and attitude questions, and the SAT employs graphics questions and command to evidence questions. So the ACT also tests the same things involving command to evidence questions, basically questioning your reasoning about a particular answer, but it's not directly formed or stated in this way or constructed, labeled as a command to evidence, a particular type of question. In this lesson, we're going to concentrate on the main idea questions based on literary passages. So main idea questions on the SAT and ACT exams test your ability to synthesize the content of the passage into an overall meaning. They may also ask you to evaluate that central meaning in the context of a specific portion of the passage. And in other words, main idea questions challenge you to take a broad, macroscopic view of the subject matter. So the following list gives some examples of common phrases used in main idea questions on the SAT and ACT. So the main idea of the passage is to, the narrator can best be described as, the author's primary purpose is to, the overall purpose of the passage is to, or the overall theme of the passage is to. Those are just some common structuring of main idea questions. Main idea questions, of course, are not limited to these types of styles, but these are really indicative of the main idea author's purpose question. If you have any questions, then please let me know. So when answering main idea questions based on a literary passage, you need to take your time reading the italicized introduction and the introductory paragraphs. Oftentimes, the passages are excised from larger pieces of literature and require additional information that the test may provide in the italicized introduction. So the beginning paragraphs will usually provide essential background information regarding setting, character development, tone, internal or external conflicts, themes, etc. However, topic sentences in literary passages are often implied rather than stated directly. So you need to read carefully. Don't rush, even in the body paragraphs. It's really important that you understand the interactions between the characters and being able to surmise an overview of what is going on in this particular scene. With that being said, there is a delicate balance that we're dealing with here because you are confined by time on this test. This is obviously, that's the main constraint that you're facing on the SAT and ACT, is that it's a timed portion test. So no matter what, we need to be pushing for speed and trying at all times to increase our reading rate by becoming more familiar with words and pushing ourselves when we're not under a testing condition to push for speed or to read faster. So speed is definitely important, but out of all the different passage types that you're going to see, literature, the literary passages are really ones where you need to vary your speeding rate depending on whether you're able to comprehend the information or not, because a lot of detail can be tied up in the structuring of the sentences, and a lot of information can be implied rather than overtly stated. So it is important that when necessary that you slow down and take your time in order to understand what is going on in the particular passage. Okay, so in the following excerpt, Benjamin Franklin retells of his childhood experience. Read the passage twice, once to push for speed and a second to annotate. During the second reading, summarize each paragraph's main idea or character development in the margins. So I'm not looking for even complete sentences or some type of lofty paragraph that's explaining what's going on. I just, while you're reading, during your second reading here, I'd like you to briefly summarize a few points that encapsulate what's going on in the paragraph, either between characters, within the character himself, or within the plot overall. Sometimes it's hard when you're trying to find the, quote, main idea of literature or literary passages. Oftentimes that means a summary of plot and setting. With more philosophical or historical works or scientific works, there's a specific objective in mind. With literature, it's not. It's a retelling of a event or a history of some sort. So it's not necessarily as if there's a poignant impression that the author is trying to leave of some type of political or socioeconomic impact. It's more it's related to telling of a story. So we're more synthesizing information than really trying to develop an argument per se. Okay, so I'm going to give you 8 minutes. I'd like you to read the passage once, pushing for speed. You're just trying to develop an overall understanding. And then in your second passage, I'd like you to jot down a few notes next to each passage about what the overall idea is going on in that paragraph. Okay, so I'll give you 8 minutes, and I'll keep track of the time in the upper left-hand corner, and I'll update the time every minute. Okay, so let's look at this passage together. So this is from Benjamin Franklin's memoir. From a young child I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. Pleased with the Pilgrim's Progress, my first collection was of John Bunyan's works in separate little volumes. I afterward sold them to enable me to buy R. Burton's historical collections. They were small Chapman's books and cheap, 40 or 50 in all. My father's little library consisted chiefly of books in polemic divinity, most of which I read, and have since often regretted that, at a time when I had such a thirst for knowledge, more proper books had not fallen in my way, since it was now resolved I should not be a clergyman. So just so you know, polemic means controversial. Divinity is of the quality of religion or of the quality of God, and a clergyman is a priest or a person of authority in a religious order. Plutarch's Lives, which I read abundantly, and I still think that time spent to great advantage. Plutarch's Lives is a short biographies written about ancient Greek and Roman leaders. It's a very old book. There was also a book of Defoe's called An Essay on Projects, and another by Dr. Mathers called Essays to Do Good, which perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events of my life. So as a summary here, I wrote a life, of reading began as a young child. Second paragraph, this bookish inclination is a tendency towards something, at length determined my father to make me a printer, though he had already had one son, James, of that profession. In 1717, my brother James returned from England with the press and letters to set up his business in Boston. I liked it much better than that of my father, but still had a hankering for the sea. Hankering means a yearning. To prevent the apprehended effect of such an inclination, my father was impatient to have me bound to my brother. The apprehended effect, to apprehend is to arrest, so something that overwhelms somebody or overtakes them, controls them. I stood out some time, but at last was persuaded and signed the indentures when I was yet but 12 years old. I was to serve as an apprentice till I was 21 years of age. Only I was to be allowed journeyman's wages during the last year. In a little time, I made great proficiency in the business, meaning success or having a high level of skill, and became a useful hand to my brother. I now had access to better books, and acquaintance with the apprentices of booksellers enabled me sometimes to borrow a small one, which I was careful to return soon and clean. Often I sat up in my room reading the great part of the night, when the book was borrowed in the evening and to be returned early in the morning, lest it should be missed or wanted. So his father sought employment for Franklin in a reading profession. And after some time, an ingenious tradesman, Mr. Matthew Adams, who had a pretty collection of books and who frequented our printing house, took notice of me, invited me to his library, and very kindly lent me such books as I chose to read. I now took a fancy to poetry and made some little pieces. My brother, thinking it might turn to account, encouraged me and put me on to composing occasional ballads. One was called The Night House Tragedy and contained an account of the drowning of Captain Worthylake and his two daughters. The other was a sailor's song on the taking of Teach, or Blackbeard, the pirate. They were wretched stuff, in the Grub Street ballad style, and when they were printed, he sent me about town to sell them. The first sold wonderfully. The event being recent, having made some great noise. This flattered my vanity, but my father discouraged me by ridiculing my performances and telling me verse makers were generally beggars. So I escaped being a poet, most probably a very bad one, but as prose writing has been of great use to me in the course of my life, and was a principal means of my advancement, I shall tell you how, in such a situation, I acquired what little ability I have in that way. So here, this was really encapsulating the fact that the printing profession offered him many opportunities. Oops. For Franklin, I'm of course referring to him by his last name. And you can also see that he gained confidence to even try writing himself. I'm not going to write that down, but that can be something that's taken from that paragraph as well. There was another bookish lad in town, Thomas Collins by name, with whom I was intimately acquainted. We sometimes disputed, and very fond we were of argument, and very desirous of confuting one another. Confuting is to prove something false. Which disputations are arguments, which disputations turn, by the way, is apt to become a very bad habit, making people often extremely disagreeable in company by the contradiction that is necessary to bring it into practice. And thence, besides souring and spoiling the conversation, is productive of disgusts and perhaps enmities, where you may have occasion for friendship. Thence is an archaic way of saying, or it means from that place. Enmities are feelings of hostility or feelings of hatred towards something or someone. Persons of good sense, I have since observed, seldom fall into it, except lawyers, university men, and men of all sorts that have been bred at Edinburgh. Edinburgh is the capital of Scotland, so there's way back, this is kind of historic. So if you have a historical understanding of the feud between England and Scotland, there's somewhat of a dig in there, because this is way, way back in time. This is in the 1700s. Okay, if you have any questions or any vocab words that you didn't understand, then please let me know in the comment section. I'd like to give you 3 minutes, and I know that's not a terribly long amount of time, but I'd like to give you 3 minutes to look at, if you had to put all of that into one coherent sentence, what would you describe the main idea or the main, the central character development that occurs in this passage? And then I'd also like you to look for 3 examples in support of that main idea. So you don't have to put a lot there for the notes. Just write down the line number and the central idea that it's reinforcing, and then we'll go through some examples. So I'll give you 3 minutes. So this is a very subjective activity. This could be anything, but what I put down is the practice, study, and love of reading provided many opportunities for Benjamin Franklin in his private and public lives. It's really just about, the central theme here was the importance of reading and the impact reading had on his life. There were some minor themes though, so if you didn't have reading, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. I asked you just to pick 3 examples, but I'm going to give you a couple examples of different topics, different central ideas that you might have picked. So for reading, I found line 1 was supportive of that. The topic sentence clearly states that he had an early interest in reading. Lines 12 through 13 talk about the philosophical works that piqued his interest or thirst for knowledge for the first time, which were books, located in books. 24 through 29, you might have found that was mentioning the career that he first involved himself in, his first career involving reading, and led to greater access and advancements and development. Lines 33 through 35 also support this theme or this central idea. It led to him writing poetry himself and gaining enough confidence in it to try to become a writer. And then 42 through 44, he talks about how even though he gave up on poetry, prose writing was really a great advantage to him throughout his life. I also saw some central ideas of encouragement, kind of a contrast really between encouragement and disappointment. So in line 13 really says, picks up on the fact that reading was the first point of his intellectual inspiration, of really opening his eyes to a new world that he found in books. Lines 24 carry on about that, with pride being good at one's profession or having pride in one's own profession. 34 is when his brother encourages him to write his own stories. 47 through 50, he describes the arguments with a close friend that he got from information about reading or from reading that inspired critical thinking and engagement that he remembers now and enjoys. And then finally, disappointment, the opposite of that. So on line 6, he is a little bit scornful of the rigidity of his family's religion and the books that he first finds in his father's library that he doesn't feel satisfied with or by. Line 40, his father disapproves of him writing poetry because he doesn't think that it's going to make him much money. His father really comes off as a very austere yet simple type of man, but very serious. 50, line 50, this is where the tone really takes a little bit of a change here, and for the first time in the passage, Franklin is really kind of rakes the people who use argument, these hypothetical people he uses as an example of those who politicize or those who argue for argument's sake and throw away treasured relationships when there's really an opportunity just to engage. But he makes a really poignant statement here, which disputatious turn, by the way, is apt to become a very bad habit, making people often extremely disagreeable in company by the contradiction that is necessary to bring it into practice. So he's saying that you argue, or some people argue to such a degree that they contradict the whole point of which they're arguing about, and that is because they're in the company of someone else. And so you forget, you mistake the trees for the forest type of thing, where you are engaged in friendship and then a topic comes up, and so you are so conceited and so forthright with your own beliefs that you're able to disregard the whole point of what you're doing in the first place, which is being friends and conversating. So there's a real turn there of disappointment that he has in the general public, and really what he's implying there is lesser read or lesser disciplined readers. If you have any questions, then please let me know. Otherwise, I'd like you to take 5 minutes and look at these questions. I can't show them all on the iPad, but they're all included in the resource document. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and please look at these questions, and then we'll review. Okay, so looking at number 1, the main purpose of the passage is to confer a personal history, provide a counter-argument to conventional thought, entertain the public masses, or influence domestic policy of the government. So here Benjamin Franklin is retelling of his childhood experiences, so we're really talking about conferring a personal history. So the answer there is going to be A. Number 2, as used in line 12, turn most nearly means. So line 12, turn is used. And another of Dr. Mather's called Essays to Do Good, which perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events of my life. So a turn of thinking, is that a particular aim of a direct goal, an improvement in personal development, a circumlocution in writing, or a change in physical direction of movement. So we're here talking about an improvement, a development in his personal self or personage. So we're talking about an answer selection B is correct. We're not talking about a physical direction, and we're not talking about writing or even an objective goal. Number 3, it can be inferred from the passage that Benjamin Franklin's father thinks poetry is rudimentary, uplifting, refined, or non-lucrative. So if we go back to lines 40, around 40, like 41, this flattered my vanity, but my father discouraged me by ridiculing my performances and telling me verse makers are generally beggars. So verse makers are generally beggars. Verse makers refer to writers that write more in stylistic rather than content-based areas. So you're talking like that could be defined, poetry is definitely defined in that area. More emotional writing or musical, pleasurous, writing for pleasure. So here, his principal complaint is that it's non-lucrative, meaning that it doesn't make any money, because he thinks that all poets are beggars, meaning they can't support themselves. And so that is supported by lines 40 through 42. Question number 5, the author's tone in lines 48 through 54. So going back to 48 through 54, we sometimes disputed, and very fond we were of argument, and very desirous of confuting one another, which disputatious turn, by the way, is apt to become a very bad habit, making people often extremely disagreeable in company by the contradiction that is necessary to bring it into practice. And thence, besides souring and spoiling the conversation, is productive of disgust and perhaps enmities, where you may have occasion for friendship. So here is his tone scornful, optimistic, realistic, or hopeful. Notice how optimistic and hopeful, and really almost realistic, but definitely optimistic and hopeful are synonyms of each other. They both can't be right in this sense. And notice that all three, B, C, and D, are positive connotations, and A is the only negative one. That's not always going to occur, but here it is a pretty good tell or signal that A is the correct answer. So he's scornful of people who take their argument too far and give up on the friendship that brings them into that occurrence in the first place. So he's saying, don't give up on your friendships, don't let argument go so far as to ruin them. And number 6, the overall progression of Benjamin Franklin's argument can best be characterized as linear, rising actions, staggered, or increasingly dramatic. So really, the organization of this passage is chronological. So that is really in relation to the temporal progression, so the passage of time. So that's a linear progression, so the answer here is going to be A. If you have any questions, then please let me know. I'm going to give you 8 minutes. Please read the following passage twice, and on the second reading, annotate each paragraph, please. You don't need to do much, just a little jot of what's going on and any vocab that might be important or unknown to you. Okay, so let's look at this passage and read it together. She found means to deceive the servants and get introduced as an unfortunate lady who wanted to complain of some matrimonial grievances, it being my grandfather's particular province to decide all cases of scandal. She was accordingly admitted into his presence, where discovering herself, she fell at his feet in the most affecting manner, implored his forgiveness. At the same time representing the danger that threatened not only her life, but that of his own grandchild, which was about to see the light. He told her he was sorry, that the indiscretion of her and his son had compelled him to make a vow, which put him out of his power to make them any assistance, that he had already imparted his thoughts on that subject to her husband, and was surprised that they should disturb his peace in any further importunity. This said, he retired. So this is where the narrator's mother begs grandfather for forgiveness. Now, some key vocab words here. So, matrimony relates to marriage. Province is like a jurisdiction or an area of control or authority. Implored means to beg. Let's see, indiscretion down here, that's like a foolish or embarrassing event. Compelled means to force, to make something to happen. Impart is to let it be known. And then I also saw importunity. So importunity is the urgent or constantly bothering somebody, being incessantly asking about something or soliciting somebody's advice or trying to sell them something. Is importunity. The second paragraph, the violence of my mother's affliction had such an effect on her constitution that she was immediately seized with the pains of childbed, and had not an old maidservant, to whom she was very dear, afforded her pity and assistance, at the hazard of incurring my grandfather's displeasure, she and the innocent fruit of her womb must have fallen miserable victims to his rigor and inhumanity. By the friendship of this poor woman, she was carried up to a garret, and immediately delivered of a man-child, the story of whose unfortunate birth he himself now relates. My father, being informed of what had happened, flew to the embraces of his darling spouse, and while he loaded his offspring with paternal embraces, could not forbear shedding a flood of tears on beholding the dear partner of his heart, for whose ease he would have sacrificed the treasures of the East, stretched upon a flock bed in a miserable apartment, unable to protect herself from the inclemencies of the weather. It is not to be surprised that the old gentleman was ignorant of what passed, though he affected to know nothing of the matter, and pretended to be very much surprised when one of his grandchildren, by his eldest son deceased, who lived with him as far as his heir apparent, acquainted him with the affair. He determined therefore to observe no medium, but immediately, on the third day after her delivery, sent her a peremptory order to be gone, and turned off the servant who had preserved her life. This behavior so exasperated my father that he had recourse to the most dreadful imprecations, and on his bare knees implored that heaven should renounce him if he should ever forget or forgive the barbarity of his sire. So some vocab words here. So we have affliction, that's the state of pain or misery. When we talk about her constitution, that's the aggregate of somebody's physical or emotional being. A garret, line 19, that's a small attic, and it's usually dark, gloomy, and like really unpleasant, so it's not really a great place. Inclemencies, that has to do with weather, so that's like severe or rough weather. And then I saw Peremptory. So peremptory means without the opportunity of denial. So there's no appeal, there's no refusing it. Exasperated. That's to make much worse or to provoke to a high degree. Recourse. Oh, excuse me, not that. Sorry, barbarity and sire is what I was going for here. Underline the wrong one. Barbarity. So barbarity is like a brutal or inhumane treatment, and sire is a male parent, and it's usually like an animal. So there's a little bit of a twinge in there about how he thinks his father was treating he and his wife, or not his wife, his baby's mother. And so, if we had to summarize what's going on here, this is really the birth of the narrator. The injuries which this unhappy mother received from her removal in such circumstances and the want of necessaries where she lodged, together with her grief and anxiety of mind, soon threw her into a languishing disorder, that means lingering for a long time, which put an end to her life. My father, who loved her tenderly, was so affected with her death that he remained 6 weeks deprived of his senses, during which time the people where he lodged carried the infant to the old man, who relented so far on hearing the melancholy story of his daughter-in-law's death and the deplorable condition of his son, as to send the child to nurse, and he ordered my father to be carried home to his house, where he soon recovered the use of his reason. Whether this hard-hearted judge felt any remorse for his cruel treatment of his son and daughter, or, which is more probable, was afraid his character would suffer in the neighborhood, he professed great sorrow for his conduct to my father, whose delirium was succeeded by a profound melancholy and reserve. At length he disappeared, and notwithstanding all imaginable inquiry, could not be heard of, a circumstance which confirmed most people in the opinion of his having made away with himself in a fit of despair. How I understood the particulars of my birth will appear in the course of these memoirs. So I'd like you to take 3 minutes rather, and just try to summarize what occurred in this passage in one statement. Again, we're not looking for a really elaborate paragraph here. And then please look for 3 examples of that central idea in the passage itself. I'll keep track of your time in the upper right-hand corner, but I'll give you 3 minutes and then we'll review. Okay, so this is, again, very subjective, is based on what you infer or interpret to be the main idea here. But as a synopsis, I came up with the narrator's life began in a dark circumstance which resulted in the death of his mother, and maddening of his father. So I saw a few central ideas. So obviously there's the central idea of pain and hardship. There's also the idea of some social taboo going on, mainly having a child out of wedlock, and then also the love that his father had for his mother. So I saw some examples of the pain definitely throughout the passage, but in particular 22 through 23, where his mother dies from childbirth. On line 32, his mother was ordered away by the grandfather and the health attendant was fired. In lines 9, we have the use of the word indiscretion to describe the whole circumstance of his mother's pregnancy with the narrator. So that's what the grandfather thought of the pregnancy in general. And 48, the judge is really just more concerned about the neighborhood's understanding of his social circumstance rather than the health and well-being of his family because of the social taboo. And then love, there's you see the devastating consequences of his mother being gone, that his father endured as a result, where it's very clear that he had a very strong and loving relationship with her. Okay, and I'd like to take the last few minutes of class. If you could please take 5 minutes and answer the following critical reading questions. Questions number 1 through 6. I'll keep track of the time in the upper right-hand corner. Oops, excuse me, 5 minutes. And then we'll review. Okay, so question number 1, the main purpose of the passage is to describe an ordeal, petition for equal rights, criticize societal norms, or buttress a pre-existing argument. So we're talking about the weeks that lead up to and the days after the narrator's childbirth, which was a particularly traumatic event for his family, which describes an ordeal. So the answer there was A. Question number 2, as used in line 7, to see the light most nearly means to come to a reckoning, to develop a greater degree of understanding, to be born, or a shift in personal beliefs. Notice how to come to a reckoning, to develop a degree of understanding, and a shift in personal beliefs are all pretty synonymous with one another. That's a clue that they can't all be right. And here what it really means, they're literally meaning that the baby is about to see the light, meaning that the baby was about to be born. Number 3, it can be inferred from the passage that the apartment mentioned in the 3rd paragraph has no roof, is under new ownership, is being sold, or has no floor. Notice that number 4 is a command to evidence question, so you can use the answer selections, or I should say the line references in question number 4 to answer number 3. So the answer to number 3 has to lie somewhere in those line sections. So 7 to 11, 20 through 26, 26 through 32, or 39 through 45. Now, in the 3rd paragraph, they pick up on the fact that the apartment couldn't protect her from the inclemencies of the weather. So if I go back up here, let me just highlight this, was unable to protect her from the inclemencies of the weather. So we could imply from that the apartment was so damaged either in the walls or in the roof, we don't know which, but it couldn't protect her from the weather alone. All right, so there's so much damage, or this apartment is in such a state of disrepair that she's not able, that she has to go through, being rained on as well. So we can assume that it has no roof, and that's supported by lines 20 through 26. Number 5, in the context of the 3rd paragraph, what effect did the death of the narrator's mother have on the narrator's father? He was physically handicapped by the experience. He was left indigent and homeless. Indigent means poor. He was unable to find gainful employment, or his personage was greatly diminished. So somebody's personage is their overall appearance and their overall constitution, their physical and emotional well-being. You have to read carefully, was he physically handicapped? No, he was kind of maddened. He was led into delirium, is I think the word that the author used. But that's not a physical handicap. That's more of like an emotional or psychological one. Indigent means that he was poor, and homeless means he didn't have a home, obviously. His father was still able to support him, and his father was this bigwig judge. So I don't think that really characterizes what's going on in this specific paragraph. He was unable to find gainful employment. Nothing in the paragraph suggests that he was even looking for employment, let alone not able to find any. Or that his employment status changed. It didn't make any reference to that at all. So the answer here is D, his personage was greatly diminished. It talks about how there was like 6 weeks of him not even being able to take care of himself and just completely in anguish. So he was, and afterwards he was never quite the same. So his personage was greatly diminished is the correct answer. And last question, in the context of the passage overall, the narrator makes use of flashback, metaphor, foreshadowing, and simile. Or simile. So remember, this is a memoir. So this person most people can't remember their own birth. So this person is using a flashback to describe the whole scenario involving or revolving around his own birth. So the answer to 6 was A, a flashback. If you have any questions on anything that we've done today, then please let me know in the comment section below. Otherwise, thank you all very much for watching. If you find these videos helpful, then please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And Dr. Tot, you want to say goodbye to everybody? Can you say bye? Can you say bye? Come on, say bye. Bye. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you all soon.